what is it that we need to understand about our debt crisis, the circumstances, and then we'll talk a little bit about crises, some interventions, cops and robbers, and then the last bullet point really is just more about where you can find information. So to start us off, and I had originally set 10 minutes for this first icebreaker, but I had placed different cards and I'd asked you before the session to set up based on your country. So in each of those cards, you're going to find two sticky notes, a pink one and a green one. And they're all propositional, right? So for your country context, if you could just spend 5 minutes answering those questions or reflecting on those questions, and we'll then very quickly come back, yeah, in your group, in your country grouping. So the countries are, there's Uganda here, South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Kenya, and Tanzania. So if I can give you 5 minutes just to discuss, and please base it on your country. And if you feel you want to join any other country because you're too many in your country, please feel free, because there are some countries that are a minority. The reason for sharing these cards is to be provocative, okay? Because many a time when we go into different negotiations, when we go to do advocacy, we go and try and influence governments, members of parliament, institutions, some of these statements come up, right? Some people say they've got bigger problems to deal with. Others, like the IMF, will tell you, well, debt, I think somebody said yesterday or on Monday, debt isn't really bad. And then it was very quickly caveated with, depends with whom and for whom. Yeah. So it's important that we start interrogating this as us, as individuals, so that we are able to internalize and associate with a particular form of narrative around what we're trying to advance. So is there any country that would like to share with the group what they came up with based on the two questions that they were, or the two scenarios that they were posed with? Zambia. Okay, Zambia.
Okay, so for Zambia, we are saying debt is important.
Private debt. The bilateral debt has gone down, multilateral debt has gone down, or multilateral creditors has gone down, the percentage of debt. And what is that telling you about the power relations? What is that telling you about the architectural system that we are working within? It's about providing or turning the social contract on its head. It's about ensuring the private individual or the private entity, the idea of private enterprise, is kept sustained through this type of model. So this is from the latest UNCTAD report on debt. And I'd encourage as many of you as possible. I've shared, the presentation has been shared, so the link is there, to really interact with this report. It's a fantastic report, a very, very important one. And together with the African Economic Outlook that was published by the African Development Bank. These are very important numbers and very important statistics. Our public debt is 1.8 trillion US dollars in 2022. Right? 1.8 trillion US dollars. So just to put that into context, yeah, of what it is we're doing, and when we say debt is good or isn't so bad, Francois.
Just a quick clarification.
Yeah.
The debt from the Chinese government, is it considered as private or as bilateral? Because it's a mixture.
It's a mixture. Here, I think they constitute it as bilateral. Sorry, but yeah, bilateral, not private. Yeah. So it's important to understand these dynamics. And the reason why this slide is important is not just because of the pure percentages. It's because of power. Yeah, it's about who then is making the rules, who then is dictating how you can negotiate, who then is dictating where your own domestic revenue, from the video we saw, the 11 seconds we saw earlier, where that money is going and what purposes it's being generated for. So, pop quiz again, because we want to make sure you are all alive, and the weather. Aid. Somebody talked about aid yesterday or on Monday, saying that it was okay. It was not so bad. It was important. I'm not sure who it was, and I don't want to put them on the spot. But how many people would agree aid is a form of debt? Yes or no? How many people say yes? Hands up. It's a form of debt. Aid is a form of debt. Okay.
Whom to whom?
Aid. Yes. You think it's? Why do you think it's a debt?
They always say you despise free food. So when you're given something which
Yeah.
is an aid which is for free, then you must be thinking of what else beyond that free offer that you've been given.
Okay. So that's a political position, right? Yeah, that's fine. How many people say no? Because I think Crystal is the one who mentioned it as a form of reparations as well, as there.
From whom to whom?
Okay. So you say no, Joab?
Yeah, I think that aid, I see aid as reparations
Okay.
of or payment of the debt or
Okay. Okay. Let me pose a different scenario for those who think aid may not be debt. Channels of delivery. A lot of aid these days is channeled through multilateral development banks. Multilateral development banks are increasingly giving non-concessional loans or even concessional loans, which means that there's an interest rate attached to it. Okay? A lot of the aid that's being invested in Africa has moved away from social sectors into big mega infrastructure projects, which are PPPs, and those are being implemented by agencies or businesses from the donor country or wherever the aid is originating from. So I posit the question again, if that may or may not change your mind about aid. Stefano.
Yeah, I think we need to have some sophistication in the way we look at it. I mean, there is some debt that actually is accounted as aid.
Yes,
Okay?
yeah.
And because of the way in which it is actually disbursed or operationalized, de facto, it accounts as aid from the countries that originates it, but actually is then debt for the ones that receives it. It's not all of aid,
Yeah.
but some of aid uses that mechanism. There's another type of debt of aid, that technically comes in the forms of grant, but has conditions attached. So it's the form of repayment is not by repaying the actual in a cash format, but sometimes the repayment is so significant in terms of policy conditionality, development orientation, and more, that you can actually consider that technically as debt.
Yeah.
Overall, I agree with Joab that aid should be a reparation.
It should be. Yes.
Should be.
Yes.
But in fact, it's turned it all around and it becomes new debt.
Yeah.
Because of these different implications.
Yeah. Don.
Just say I agree with Stefano. And in fact, for me, I would say aid is a form of theft.
Okay.
Because
I'm going to write
as
that
I'm saying,
here.
There's no free lunch.
Yeah.
So you claim you're giving me aid,
Yeah.
but you're using it to distort me completely till I'm losing more than I'm gaining.
Yeah, and I think
Especially in my policy space.
exactly, and I think Jane also made this point in the previous session about linking to you about the tying. So procurement, I think it's in Uganda recently. Was it the Belgians that were tendering for road construction, and only Belgian companies were allowed to bid for it? You know, these are the kind of things that we're talking about, yeah. But then the poster will say this is, you know, EU aid helping Uganda, etc., etc. So it's important to understand these dynamics. Next question, pop quiz, 60 seconds. How many debt instruments can you name? Anyone? Anyone?
Eurobond.
Okay, bonds, yes. Sorry? You have to speak up, Judith. Which one? Vulture funds. Okay, vulture funds, yes. Loans is an overall. It's but the instrument itself, the actual instrument. Sorry?
Collateralized debt instruments,
Collateralized debt instruments, yes. Treasury bills,
mortgage-based instruments.
Yes, mortgage-based, yes. Anyone else? Sorry? Debentures, yes. Anyone else? Right, it's important. It's important for us to understand when we talk about debt what we are referring to. Yeah? Because different debt instruments play different purposes when a government borrows. So if a government borrows treasury bills, most often than not, or issues treasury bills rather, most often than not they're using that for recurrent expenditure or government operations. Yeah? Of course it's very problematic how they do it, but there's a whole cartel that's associated with how those T-bills are issued. I know in Kenya, for example, they're constantly issuing 90-day, 120-day, 180-day T-bills because they're trying to maintain government operations and so on and so forth. You've got the bonds, this means you go to capital markets or equity markets and you tell the bondholders, give me X billion and I will give you it back plus whatever interest rate. Many countries, Zambia, Kenya, Ghana, are countries that are struggling with having taken that type of approach in terms of that. And those are usually short to medium term duration in terms of maturity. And you take that money and you're able to do whatever you need to do, whether it's pay salaries, infrastructure programs, and so on and so forth. The collateralized one, which is something that is becoming, not many people talk about it, but it's equally important, is how you collateralize your natural resources. So particularly countries like Zambia, Zimbabwe, countries like Chad, where they have had, they continue to have these issues where you tie up your natural resources and you tell the investor, look, I'll give you X amount acres of land versus plus whatever value of the natural resource we have. When you extract it, convert it into whatever finished product, you can have it if you give us X billion of dollars in investment. That's a way of tying it in. There's also something called resource-backed loans. Yeah, so it's important to appreciate and understand these different types of debt instruments. There are also syndicated loans that governments borrow from the domestic sector. And in many countries, I think Zambia is another example where domestic debt, Malawi, even Kenya, where domestic debt is becoming a big problem, where you borrow from domestic banks. And again, there's a whole set of issues there that become problematic because you have a situation where there's risk of collusion between the banks in terms of how they issue the syndicated loans to governments at the domestic level. You have probably the central bank also in collusion, even though it's the regulating authority. And I've given away the answer to the next question, which let me go to that. Can we name at least 3 debts in your little country groups, 3 debt oversight institutions, bodies or entities in your country, if you can name them? I will go around very quickly. Let's start with Zimbabwe. Yeah. Central Bank. Reserve Bank. Yeah. Parliament. Okay. Tanzania. Bank of Tanzania. Okay. Treasury. Those 2. Parliament. Okay. In Kenya. 3 oversight institutions, bodies, or entities. Treasury. Okay. Zambia. Parliament. Central Bank. DMO, the court. Okay. Uganda. Parliament. Ministry of Finance. Central Bank. Okay. South Africa.
South African Reserve Bank.
Reserve Bank. Okay, so that's the central bank. Yes. Okay. Okay. So there's and Siatini. Oh, of course. Yeah. Of course. Most definitely. Okay. So it's important to know, I mean, how many of you think the Auditor General should be an oversight or institution or body that looks after debt? Anyone who disagrees? Because there are hands that have not gone up. Are they? Are they a recognized oversight body in Kenya? Recently, what did the Auditor General say about Kenya's debt? That she could not audit it. Right? So how many people believe the judiciary or the courts in the land should be oversight bodies on issues of public debt? Okay. Why?
Because most of the debt acquired through legal contracts. So I think the courts should be involved to provide that oversight.
Okay, but it's also a power issue, right? So you can imagine if you were to contract debt with a foreign entity, a bilateral creditor or private creditor, the ability of the court to arbitrate or interpret those contracts domestically is a big deal, right? To about sovereignty. We've talked about that a lot. We talked about global processes on Monday and the African Union Commission and the different institutions. So the idea is, can we get our domestic, our national institutions, different institutions empowered? How many think the Attorney General's office has a role to play on debt? Okay, Don?
Yes, I mean, most debts are contracts. And the chief government legal advisor should give advice on whether the contracts are in keeping with the country's laws, rules, and regulations.
Yeah, exactly. Because they're the custodians of and the ones who negotiate those contracts. So that is just to sort of get us to understand the 4 W's and the H. Yeah, but then the last one on the H is how do we get into these problems and these challenges? And there's a combination of things. There are some that are internal to our countries, our regions, our continent, and there are some that are external. So this is just a very non-exhaustive list, but just something to trigger your minds and excite your minds to think about. In the first questions that were asked, is debt bad? This is the reason. One of the internal struggles that we have is because we follow that rationale that debt is not bad. And so when we develop our development strategies, when our governments are setting out their NDSs for the next 5, 10, 15 years, their mindset is already about we're going to borrow X amount of money to fund X, Y, Z of projects. So the mindset is already geared towards borrowing rather than actually job.
I think the problem with that starts with who develops our development strategies.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, because I remember, in Kenya, there is a year actually when they had a budget that matched our revenues. When Muraria was the Minister of Finance, we didn't need to borrow. But when we start developing all these big strategies, we bring in consultants or technical advisors. They develop our strategy with their other clients in mind.
Exactly. And I think that goes to the point of who mentioned it? I think Isaac, who mentioned it on Monday. When you have the IMF sitting in your Ministry of Finance or in your central bank, of course they're the ones thinking, exactly what Joab is saying. Of course, there's the governance issue. We cannot run away from that. No matter how much we lambast the global architecture, there are some inherent issues around governance in our own national settings that we need to deal with. I think there's every country that is here has elucidated some of that in the last 3 days. Of course, the creditor landscape, you saw how the dynamics have changed there. The idea of debt at the domestic level now is about the return. Every creditor is lending not with a development agenda or a developmental idea in mind, but they are lending because they can see that there's a return that's coming. Yeah, and that is why the point that Don made on Monday about, it's a segue, a slight segue on the Epstein Bank case, becomes very interesting here about this profit-driven creditor landscape. can we, in the debt movement, think about the role or the pervasive role private creditors are playing when they deliberately know that there are some countries that are not going to be able to pay, but still lend. We saw this in Mozambique, and that's an example that we can use. Of course, there's the role of credit rating agencies. We don't have a strong Pan-African approach, and then the global power dynamics that exist. As I said before, these things do not happen in isolation. There's an ecosystem. The WTO tells you can't use subsidies, you can't use taxes, you can't protect your because it's against WTO rules, equal and access to trading and so on and so forth. And then you're left with only exporting coffee beans, or having to make a decision like Kenya just to export flowers and fish. But you cannot export a car
And import fish.
and then import fish from China, yes. You can't export a car, you can't export a laptop, you can't put the components together of a laptop to export. And then what ends up happening is you then go to the IMF and tell them, well, we need a macroeconomic stability program. They come and tell you there's consolidation, there's regressive taxes, and then the World Bank comes and tells you, well, because the IMF has told you to cut your public expenditure, we have this great idea where you can just privatize all these national entities. So that global power relation is very important to understand. That ecosystem, yeah? Like I said on Monday, there are three things that you'll always be guaranteed with the IMF. Fiscal consolidation, taxes, and now I've forgotten the third one because it's just escaped from me. But there's a third one. Austerity, yeah, sorry. Yeah. So those are the things that you need to always keep in mind. That the cycle that we're in with the external triggers is that every economic or macroeconomic policy advice we receive is about debt servicing. It's about at the moment, it's about keeping the creditor happy. Prior to that, it's about keeping the ecosystem of extraction going on. So that's why they tell you to liberalize. That's why they tell you to provide tax incentives and tax holidays and so on. So that complexity is very important for us to understand. Francois?
Perhaps one to add.
Yes.
The impact of monetary policies and especially exchange rate.
Yes.
It was highlighted quite heavily yesterday.
Yes, correct. So the next part of what I wanted us to talk about when we're thinking about debt, and I know you're probably thinking, why aren't we talking about ratios? Why aren't we talking about debt sustainability analysis? Why aren't we talking about debt management offices and so on and so forth? There's a reason for that, because I think most of you will be familiar with some of those numbers, and perhaps there will be another opportunity to go into them in depth. But it's important for us to understand the political economy of what debt is all about and why it is important for us to be aware of this dynamic. So, a few years ago, I came up with this idea of, there's the conventional PPPs that we all know, which is the public-private partnerships, yeah? But there's a different type of PPPs we need to start appreciating and start to get our minds around. The first P is around power. Who wields the power? And the moment we're able to understand that, then we can start putting together our ideas, our positions, and the kind of influencing and advocacy that we want to do on issues of public debt and whether we should borrow or not. And power here doesn't mean it's the global north, the IMF or the World Bank that has the power. Yesterday there was a conversation about oil in Nigeria, one of the largest oil producers in the world, but it exports crude oil and imports petroleum. When you look at the UNCTAD report I referenced here, when you look at the next frontier of discussion around finance, economy, trade, and commerce, everyone is talking about critical minerals or strategic minerals. Many of those minerals are found on our continent. So we need to understand and appreciate actually who has power. Yeah? We should not assume that power is external to our continent. We should not assume power is external to our leaders and our nations. And this is at a very high level. Yeah, of course, when you bring it down to the national, regional and national levels, those dynamics take different approaches. The second P is about policies. And this is linked to what Joab was talking about yesterday and what is just mentioned now. Who is designing our policies? What are the policies that we are actually advocating for or endorsing as citizens, as a region, as a continent? To whose benefit? Why is it so wrong to have a policy that protects your own domestic interests? Every country outside of the continent in the global north designs and develops and pursues policies that protects their own interests. Whether it is economic, political, security, strategic, that is what they do. So why is that any different for us as a continent? And you think about that in the context of why then we are forced to borrow. Because our policies dictate that we cede policy space on monetary policy, on fiscal policy, on trade policy, on investment policy, on energy policy. The energy charter that Judith was mentioning this morning, right? The ratification process that Joab was taking us through yesterday, that is part of the policy environment at the continental level. Why is it that we are not doing advocacy? Why is it that we are not encouraging our governments to ratify these continental protocols that can actually help move and transform our economies, move and help us, improve our power relations? And the third P is about people. I think I heard Joab mention under oversight institutions, bodies, that it's people also. What will it take to make people angry enough to go to the streets collectively? What is it that will make sure that people are at the center of everything that we do, whether it is to do with power, whether it is to do with policies? And why is this third P very important? Is because debt affects each and every single person in our region. It doesn't matter whether you are a minister or a security guard. That same minister, when the Treasury says no more per diems, no more allowances, or if you're an MP, the constituency, you'll suffer. If your money is not coming, you cannot go and give your constituents. You have to put it out of your own pocket. Yeah? So it's very important that as for people that we ensure that it is all people-centered. It's about reclaiming back that social contract that both Crystal and Ishmael spoke about. And debt as an instrument of finance is actually a very disruptive way of disenfranchising people from that social contract, because you are constantly asked to pay the debt on behalf of the government through taxation. Those who are in Kenya will know how tough things are becoming because of the different taxes that are being levied. Yeah? And the taxes are not to raise revenue. The taxes are to pay debt. Right? Please do not get it twisted or confused in any other way. Yeah? We are not raising revenue. We are raising debt servicing. It doesn't matter what PR cycle the government wants to tell you. You are being taxed to pay creditors. That is it. And this second set of PPPs is very important if we want to be rule makers and not rule takers. On the slides that you have received, there are 2 YouTube videos that you can watch at your leisure that just try to connect the debt issue on the continent, but also link it to a bit more around inequality and about the people-centeredness about debt and why and how debt affects things like investments in education, in health, how it affects taxation, and so on. So, in numbers, I think Judith had asked us, interest rate payments and other public expenditures. So, yes, Stefano.
Yeah, no, just to intersect
Yeah.
your discourse, and something that sometimes helps me understand the debt dynamics is forget about external debt, but also think about households. Because, the debt decision making is the same, So you only have 3 situations. one, you have a surplus. Let's say, in whichever period, in governmental terms, it will be a primary surplus. And therefore, you say, if this surplus is so much, how can I use that in a multi-year term to maybe do some major multi-year investments that I can't afford on an annual basis? This is normally the decision-making process of a mortgage. I want to buy a house. I can't afford it on any 1 year, but maybe I can afford on a 20 years.
Yeah.
Now, the idea of a primary surplus is just not existent in any of our countries, because we actually run primary deficits already, okay? So if you run a primary deficit, the only way to finance a debt is either to decide that you stop doing something. Now, this decision never comes in conjunction with a debt, with a loan decision-making process. Like, I incur a loan and therefore I decide to slim, to go on a diet on a number of things. So the only thing which is left, you don't have a primary surplus, you don't decide what not to do, is to inflict the cost on somebody. There's no other space. And that's the reason why, unfortunately, very often, debts result in increasing taxation or anyway revenue, mostly on the population.
Yeah.
That's unfortunately is the very faulty mechanism of debt financing. No primary surplus, no decision what not to do. Therefore, you've got to get the money from somewhere else. And where is that in a context of very low corporate taxation? On the population.
On the population,
in chasing
yeah.
street vendors and in doing all sorts of other acrobatics that tend to not work out, by the way.
Yeah.
So because of the obvious incapacity of a struggling population community to actually engage into any significant revenue generation. So that's a little bit where the debt trap comes in.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. I think that's a very important point as this slide comes up. You can see, just to further emphasize the point about IMF programs that are currently being rolled out across the continent as we speak, this is exactly what is happening. The IMF advice is actually geared towards this, this blue line here, or this blue bar in this bar chart, right? It is to divert money from, or resources from, education, health, investment in productive sectors, revenue generating sectors, to servicing interest on loans and servicing your creditors. So it's just, again, just to make that point that this is, and then here is a bit more of an explicit example of countries that have, are spending more on net interest than in education, investment, and health. So you can see health, how many, 25 countries have deprioritized health, right, in favor of paying interest. And I think, can anyone tell me what the consequence of this is? In particular, these two, education and health. Does anyone think, from the conversations we've had since Monday, can anyone tell me what they feel or think the consequence of de-investing or diverting money from education and health in favor of creditors means? Christmas. An increase in illiteracy levels, yes, that's one. Job?
I think it's a development issue.
Okay.
Means if you can't access good health, it affects your personal development. Can link it also to nutrition. If your brain development for school-going kids is impacted, you can imagine the kind of citizens that we're bringing up as a country.
Okay, Grace and then Afshin, yeah.
Also link it to quality of life.
Quality of life, okay.
The labor that comes out of that. So that means they won't be productive.
Okay. Okay, Afshin?
We need to further feature this
There can be a means of increasing debt when in future.
Increasing future deaths, not death, maybe deaths as well. Anyone else? Ivy.
Lower levels of education, especially for women,
Uh-huh.
of the patriarchal nature of our country.
Yeah, so, okay, impact. Tom?
I'm seeing it in terms of human capital.
Uh-huh.
In the youth, the impact on the youth who are supposed to go through education. And under health, there is going to be a serious mental health problem. And the development of in Africa in terms of human capital is going to be very low. And that, to me, it is going to have a negative impact on the African 2063 development agenda, which is really going to take us backward as a country.
Okay, yes.
It increases dependence.
Okay, okay.
Because if you're not educating your people, you're not providing good health, then at the end of the day, it increases dependence and the vicious cycle of borrowing.
Okay, yes. Christmas.
I think macroeconomically, at the local level, with most of the expenses related to paying interest are not on public services, which of course will be evaluated over time. There may be increased instability within the country, and of course rise to other vices such as crime.
Okay. Okay, I want us to think about this from, I mean, everything everyone has said is absolutely correct. I want us to think about it from a political economy analysis that we have been, Stefano. No, Karen. Because I will forget. So, what we've been discussing around the role of de-investment or diversion of resources, what it means for policies. So if we're not putting people at the center of our policies, we're putting creditors, there's a certain type of policy framework that's going to be then imposed, right? So maybe not everybody here is an economist or has studied economics, but would have interacted with something called government failure. So if a government failed to provide something, there's a gap. Someone or something has got to step in to fill that gap. In this context, who do we think are the entities or persons that are going to fill in the education and health gap? Sorry? I heard, yes? Private sector. Yeah? The private sector steps in. So what happens in a country like Kenya, where you have no public health, but it's only private health? What happens? Or in any country for that matter, what happens when you have private health care as your main system of accessing healthcare? It becomes expensive, yes? Yeah,
Class-based.
it's class-based, yeah. So you marginalize a big segment of society, which then leads to the other developmental challenges that you've all talked about. The vices, the mental health issues, the type of population that is being produced. Right? So again, going back to this point that the debt crisis is not by accident. It's by design. You distract. The gorilla video, yeah? There's a distraction. We're being distracted to have to service debt at the expense of developing our people, of keeping them healthy, our children, our girls, our youth. Yeah? And you'll keep hearing people say there's the youth dividend, there's a youth bulge in Africa, so we're okay. We should be excited that we have a youthful population. But how do you have a youthful population that's not educated? That's not healthy? What good is it? What good is it? Yes, Stefano.
Yeah, I just want to try and go back to the connecting of the dots yesterday. I mean, if you look at that graph, it's quite interesting where the major pressure in terms of social spending is, right? The graph is intuitive. It's interesting that that's precisely the area in which Bretton Woods institutions have been pushing for the privatization of health the financialization of health that mostly comes through the transformation of the health through insurances, and also the digitalization of health. Now, you clearly see how the pressure that is exercised in the kind of transformation and policy conditionalities in situations of that distress helps this agenda, because the state becomes less able to actually organize health delivery and health services. That's where then the privatization agenda kicks in, because the state is failing. This is where the financialization kicks in, because they say, wait a second, rather than thinking about delivering health, why don't we just pay for insurances?
Yeah.
And that's an example of financialization. And digitalization, we still don't see it, but it's coming. And what does it mean is that you can probably have situations in which you're told, wait a second, why do you need good African surgeons? You just buy robotics, and you're going to have an Australian or US surgeon that can operate surgeries through robotics. So don't need to have your own capacity, Don't worry, just pay for it, we'll deal with it. Now, and that slide shows how debt is functioning to that agenda of privatization, digitalization, and financialization. It's immediate.
I think, and this is, this last point is absolutely fantastic, and I hope John is here taking notes, because, the role of digitalization and AI is a huge factor in some of these things. When, again, talking about the youth bulge and so on. So thank you for really raising that. So again, next slide, crises and interventions. I belatedly put a pop quiz here. How many crises can we name in 1 minute? Just put your hands up and name a crisis. Any economic, political, whatever crisis, global, that you want to name in the last 2,000 years. If you're Christian, you believe the world has been around for about 2,023 years. If you're not, then you believe it's been around for longer. So how many crises can we name? Just hands up, Afshin. Climate crisis, okay. Judith? Same as climate. Yes? Russia, Ukraine, Cadence? Child? Oh, so child mortality, okay, yes. COVID-19. Tom? Which one? So the global financial crisis, okay. Anyone else? Crises. We don't think there's been enough crises. Global crises. Sorry? Yes, colonialism, okay. Very good. The world wars. Okay, the pandemics, the debt crisis, yeah. Ruto in the he's going to become a global crisis, I'm sure. Okay, it's important. It's important to understand how crises and their interventions shape the debt architecture and shape the trajectory of indebtedness on our continent. I think I yesterday was reading about, colonialism. That was a massive crisis that took place that reconfigured an entire continent in 1884, 1885. Who knows what happened then? And I think the veterans in the room should not answer this question. They know themselves. 1884, 1885, what happened? What happened? Pan-African advocates, guys and ladies, guys and gals, 1884, 1885. The vets are not allowed to answer that, and you're not allowed to ask Google. Yeah? The vets know themselves. That's why they're very quiet. They've not said anything. they're answering emails right now. So, who knows what happened in 1884, 1885? The Berlin Conference, yes. That was the split. That was the marking and what Honorable Kanyisile talked about. The artificial borders. I heard Nambuso asking Ishmael a couple of days ago whether he's Zulu because of his headgear and his name. And he managed to explain that actually there's a similarity between the tribes from, the tribe he comes from in Zambia and the Zulu people in South Africa. That was a massive crisis. That is what put the wheels in motion for what we have today as what we call the debt crisis on our continent. Because it's converted our barter exports, I think somebody was talking about barter trade on Monday, to a monetized credit type exchange and mode of exchange. We went from, let us provide for our own communities or kingdoms, to start now competing that we must produce more than the other so that we can commodify and monetize. That was a huge crisis, right? It changed, it completely changed how we as a continent could and would and perhaps would have approached global economy, global trade, global commerce. Yeah. Yesterday, Crystal was mentioning during dinner that in Kenya, there's over 400 indigenous foods that have become extinct in Kenya, right? Since colonialism, the colonial period. And you can imagine what that has done to food systems. Yeah? How many of you know that what type of farming or agriculture was practiced in Africa before colonialism? Just hazard a guess. What type of agriculture was practiced? Okay, and what was it substituted or replaced with? You were there yesterday, you're using the leakage from yesterday. Yes, okay, we were doing mostly domestic subsistence agriculture. And when I say subsistence, I don't mean necessarily at the household level. It was at the kingdom or community level. And that was replaced by a food production system that was geared to export, so cash cropping. So the extraction that we've been talking about, the extractive model, yeah, doesn't just go back to minerals, oil and gas, natural resources. It goes back right to the fundamental things we consume in terms of food. All of those things were changed. So very important for us to appreciate how deep and how disruptive 1884, 1885 has been to our continent in the context of debts. Of course, there have been other crises. I won't go into them very in detail because you all have the slides. I'm surprised nobody mentioned the 80s crisis, because this is what gave rise to the birth of financialization, the birth of structural adjustment programs, the birth of PRSPs, right? And really cemented and ingrained the IMF into our national domestic policy making process and agenda. The crisis in the 80s. You can see all the different types of crises that took place in the 90s. Again, very important that there were economic crises that were related not just to macroeconomic instability, but also a lot to do with the role of the WTO, which Jane talked about this morning, the fact that negotiations on certain critical points of trading relationship between developing countries and developed countries could not agree. And in fact, the negotiations actually stalled for many, many, many years as a result of that. So very important for us to remember these crises and understand where they originate from and how they continue to impact policy making, how they continue to affect the power dynamic and the power relationship, and how they continue to impact people. That second set of 3 Ps that I've mentioned, yeah? Politics, power, and people. These crises are very, very important. Of course, somebody mentioned the global financial crisis. We remember the too big to fail narrative that was spun around and the massive bailouts that the banks received. And of course, we have COVID-19 and that. So crises are important to understand why we've not had an opportunity to actually change or reform or even reorganize the global architecture, but instead the politics is about letting the existing institutions remain in power And that is why some of the points that of the session that Joab, Stefano, and Jane took us through on Monday become very important. Now, in the interest of time, I want to move on. Cops and robbers. Another pop quiz. Who are the cops? When it comes to debt, economic governance, who are the robbers? Who are the cops? Sorry? US Treasury, okay. They are the cops. Anyone else? Anyone else? Who are the robbers? Who are the robbers? Sorry? Political parties, okay, okay. Who else? Robbers. How many think they're both the same? One and the same set of people? Well, oh yeah, that's one way of looking at it. Exactly. So again, the reason I put this here for you to understand, for us to understand collectively why debt and its connection with trade, with the law, with parliamentarians, with the global system and our continental system, sometimes the lines are very gray. And they can be both one and the same. Yeah? As Stefano mentioned on Monday, the IMF has been categorically, no, sorry, it was Don who mentioned, yeah? The IMF is categorically responsible for the problems this continent is facing. But at the same time, it plays, maybe I should have put good cop, bad cop there, but in any case, it plays this very schizophrenic role. Yeah, on the one hand, it's very disruptive to your macroeconomic, monetary, fiscal policy and your transformation agenda, but at the same time, it finds legitimacy in underpinning you in terms of the policy and legitimizing a credit system that allows you to access finance. It's a very schizophrenic dynamic that exists there. So again, it's important to realize who the cops and robbers are in the debt system, in the debt architecture. There's credit rating agencies, massive, massive robbers, yeah? Because they're the ones who undermine and put the risk premium on African governments in terms of borrowing domestically, so they've got to go out and borrow from the international market. They're the first people to downgrade you if you start saying, I have a debt problem, I can't. I mean, what's wrong with admitting you have a debt problem? Why downgrade you? You're admitting the problem, right? And so what you're seeking is assistance to fix the problem. How many of you heard about Ecuador recently that refused to issue any new oil contracts for exploration, but then immediately got its credit rating downgraded by, and the IMF said this was a bad idea? Yeah, yes, exactly. How many people are aware of that? Anyone? Look it up. Look it up. Ecuador got its credit rating downgraded because it has refused to issue any future contracts for oil exploration. And the IMF has criticized Ecuador. Now, the reason I'm bringing this example up is because we are in the midst of a climate emergency. Everyone is saying, don't invest in fossil fuels. Look for green energy, energy transition will give you climate finance. So here's a country that has said, okay, guys, we're good, we'll listen to you, no more oil contracts. And then all of a sudden, now you can't access finance because you've been downgraded. You can't access your creditors because you've been downgraded. They're not going to put money in. So it tells you again how schizophrenic the system is. Yeah, when you try and comply, you get hammered. When you don't comply, you also get hammered. Yeah, very important point to understand who the cops and robbers are in this sense. The neoliberal economic model is the biggest robber in our continent. The model of extraction, the fact that our leaders are very comfortable with allowing foreigners to develop their policies, to even call a conference on our continent and allow foreigners to dictate what that agenda is going to be. All of these things are important because when you listen to what came out of the African Climate Summit, and these are the dots I'm trying to connect with debt, and I hope we're all seeing them. All of a sudden, the Kenyan government is not talking about debt relief, debt cancellation. All of a sudden, Yet it's a country that's on the verge of defaulting on one of its Eurobonds. Yeah? Has it defaulted already? Are you shaking the markets, Isaac? But you can see the warped nature of what foreign influences are having on our politics and our direction as a continent. So very important to understand who cops and robbers are in this sense. And this is where we've ended up, sort of, yeah, because we don't know who the cops are, but we know who the robbers are. Because essentially, the model is continue borrowing, right? That is what we're doing. That is what every piece of advice our government is receiving, is continue borrowing. Debt for climate swap. What does that mean? You're borrowing money, yeah? Debt for education swap, you're borrowing. Climate finance, bring in the private sector, you're borrowing through PPPs, right? It's very important for us to understand that this is exactly the cycle that we're in. So, again, I called it COVIDnomics because in COVIDnomics, that's what happens, right? That's exactly what happened. Ishmael talked about it briefly with the DSSI, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative. They were only suspended. And it's very important for us in the COVID period to understand that that's what happened, yeah? They were suspended. They were not cancelled. They were not removed. And so when the repayments came back up and were due after 2 years, and we had been borrowing again during that period, things were very, very difficult. We have the G20 Uncommon Framework. Our friends from Zambia can tell us, and I know Isaac will talk a little bit about that. There are severe issues that are going on there. I think Kenya might end up going down that route very soon. Ghana is already there. Ethiopia is there. Chad is there. And then there's Sri Lanka and Suriname, I think, from outside the continent. But it's a very problematic framework that exists. You'll often hear the issue around, but we had HIPIC, which is the Highly Indebted Poor Country Initiative. We had MDRI, which is the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, and debt cancellation in the early 2000s. And so why is Africa still in that phase? Again, connecting the dots. You cannot have debt relief or cancel someone's debt, and you can't allow them to produce. You can't allow them to move up the value chain. You can't allow them to tax multinational corporations. And you allow them to have subsidiaries in tax havens. You allow illicit financial flows to be generated and moved from the continent to tax havens. Your policy will not work. Your fiscal space that is created from that debt cancellation will not work. Because you're immediately trying to plug those gaps, right? So it's like putting, it's like being stabbed with a knife, a very deep knife, and then all you put is cotton wool and expect the bleeding to stop and the wound to heal. It will not work. And these are the systemic issues, yeah? These are the systemic issues that Jane and Stefano talked about on Monday that we must be cognizant of, yeah? So I hope we start to understand where we're going with this. And so again, we have the same sort of dynamics. It's the IMF. It's all about conditionalities. It's all about trying to make sure that we sustain the system. The biggest propagators of the challenges that we face are the same people who are trying to provide the solutions. That song that Jane mentioned by Belafonte, The Hole in the Bucket, is a very apt song, actually. Not just for the trade system, not just for the advocacy, but also for the debt situation. Yeah? Because of how we go around in circles thinking that the same people who cause the problems are the people who can actually solve them. So we have of course we have a debt architecture that exists within a broader financial architecture. And I know we've talked a lot about how broken the global financial architecture is. So I won't belabor that too much. Safe to say that the system, just like with the tax space, just like with the trade space, the system is set up to protect the creditor, right? That's very, very important. it is set up to protect the creditor. That is why in the presentation that Ranga and Don made on Monday, we are very keen to understand how the law can redress that situation at a domestic level, at a national level. So a situation where in case of a dispute with the creditor, we can go to our national courts and deal with them there. In case that, loans are taken contrary to our laws, our constitution, and our policies, they can be classified as a legitimate debt and therefore should not be paid back, as is the case in Mozambique with the tuna bond scandal. A situation where, the Epstein Bank know your customer type idea can actually work out in the debt system. The architecture, when in the climate emergency that we're facing, we can actually have climate clauses as safeguards within our debt contracts, so that climatic emergencies actually provide some sort of space for our governments when they are faced with this crisis. So, very important. I think it was Judith who mentioned the return on debt investment or debt finance has been very low. And that is very true because of where the investments are taking place and the type of debt finance that's being used. So I think it's important for us to pay attention to that and give that some time. So as I wrap up, I just want to encourage us to, under views and news, of course we have our website. This is a bit of promotion here now for Afrodad. It's part of the job, but I hope you don't mind. The website is there. We have a YouTube channel as well that has some more of those videos that are on the presentation, but a lot more. There's a piece by Don that he gave last year at AFCOD 2 in Malawi. I seriously encourage you to watch that particular one because he talks about the protocols of the African Union and how much progress, at least on the peace and security side, we've made in actually getting things ratified and so on. But the importance of encouraging all of these things. And these are important because they all form part of the African financial architecture that we want. Yeah. And so as we head there, the next idea is for us to, is it going to change? I think it's had enough of me talking. So maybe I'll just stop there. But it wants a tea break, yeah. But in any case, comrades, that is what the debt module under DADA was all about. It was not necessarily to take us through the nitty-gritties of where to get debt statistics, because I think all of us know where to get those things from. But it's important, again, the voice from above. I am stopping. So thank you. I hope, are there any questions for the last segment? I know there was no pop quiz towards the end, but are there any comments or questions that anyone would like to ask with the last segment of the presentation? And I realize we have gone very quickly through this, but just trying to catch up with time as well. Zambia?
Not really on the last part, but I think I have a reflection on the entire presentation that you made.
Yes.
There is a saying that says, if you consume tomorrow's today, you stay hungry tomorrow.
Yes.
So if we take debt as a negative deposit on our accounts, I feel we don't need to borrow. We just need to strengthen our domestic resource mobilization so that we live within our means, so we don't have to stay hungry.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Absolutely. Anyone else, Job?
We were going through the crisis of 80s, 90s, 2000s. I didn't see any from Africa. Just wondering what that means.
Well, that's a very good question. And even the ones for the 2000s, for the exception to some extent of the global financial crisis, it also tells you how, as a continent, our level of integration in global trade, global commerce, global finance, how limited in those decades. Because you recall, in that period, many of our countries had just become independent as well. So we're also riding that wave. Of course, we felt the impact of the high oil prices and that's when we started to find our currencies depreciating. Yeah, but the actual time when a global crisis actually affected the continent in real terms, at least from what my reading has been, was COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic really showed how deeply integrated the continent has become in the last 50, 60 years into global economy and global trade. Global supply chains had stopped because a lot of raw materials were coming from the continent. And as a result of that, we were not able, even that small primary commodity revenue that we were able to get were not there. Unless you wanted us to put the military coups, if those are type, although I know you want to engage with military coup leaders and stuff like that. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, when you're doing a presentation, there's a point where we were mentioning about institutions and how they can be of essence
Yes.
in advising government. We talked about institutions like the General. But if you notice in Africa, in most of the countries, these institutions do not give proper advice to the president either. And many times they will just give advice that the president would want to hear, just in line with their thoughts and all that. I didn't clearly hear about the role of the civil society who are more of the independent-minded individuals in this role, and I would be happy to know how then can they also be organized or coordinated to ensure that their voice is more heard when the issues of debts are being discussed, because clearly our institutions, our independent institutions, do not do their role properly.
Yeah, I mean, the role of civil society is very important, and we're actually more organized than the government gives us credit for. The only issue is access. How do we access those corridors in Parliament, in the Ministry of Finance, in the Central Bank, in the Office of the President, to articulate some of these things? I'll give you a very good example. When the special drawing rights were issued, this is the currency from the IMF. We cautioned many many parliamentarians not to just necessarily speak very highly and praise the fact that these SDRs or special drawing rights were issued, because three things were happening. Number one, the amount of money that was coming to our governments was very small as relative to what the actual need was. Yeah, and so we needed to question why this thing was happening. Number two, the relationship between the central bank and the Ministry of Finance in some countries on the continent is very vague, because what happens is the special drawing rights first goes to the central bank, and then the central bank lend it to the Ministries of Finance. And we did a lot of this advocacy work, trying to explain and advise governments to be very cautious, even how to use the special drawing rights. The challenge we have, of course, is that we come up against IMF officials who are sitting in the Treasury and who are very good at calling out civil society organizations for being disruptive, for not knowing what it is, for not knowing what we're saying and things like that. But we are very organized, and I think Stefano and Jane mentioned it. The achievements that we've managed to get on the, let me start at the national level. In Zimbabwe, even though you may think it is a very difficult environment, but on 2 occasions, civil society groups have gone to court and challenged the Minister of Finance to publish debt data. And they've ruled in favor of civil society organizations. Honorable Chidakwa here has on 3 occasions raised it in Parliament, asking the Finance Minister, can he update on publication. The Mozambique case, the tuna bond scandal that we talked about when Don and Ranga were making a presentation, it was a civil society group that actually brought the case to the domestic court. In Zambia, before or just during the point when they defaulted, they took the former trade minister to court about his borrowing habits and things like that. Even though that case was lost, it was an important point for civil society because it was raised by civil society groups. So there are those opportunities, and I know Isaac and I think Mukasiri will be taking us through about how civil society can organize and stuff like that. Okay, I need to stop. It's 12:15. But are there any other burning questions or comments? I think you all have the presentation at this point. Ishmael, you're not allowed to challenge me because I challenged you yesterday. So I hope this is not revenge. Yes.
Especially, there have been cases where certain countries want to allocate their SDRs to developing countries, but the IMF would not just give it to them, but they give it to them as loans with conditionality. I don't know if any work has been done with that.
So I want to, because Stefano is also going to start pointing a knife at me when I start talking about special drawing rights. It's a very technical question, and the special drawing rights is a very technical issue, but in some, it's not a failure. Okay, so but there is agreement to rechannel. So for example, what they're going to try and do is rechannel the special drawing rights through the African Development Bank. Okay, the problem is with this, and Afrodad has articulated this many a times, is that they are converting free money into loans. Right? That's the biggest problem. And the wealthier countries have said that their central banks are not willing to sign off on just issuing free money because they're the ones taking the risk or absorbing the risk. Yeah? So that's where we are on special drawing rights. We can have an entire day on special drawing rights, but in some, that's sort of where the position is, and that's where the direction of travel is. Yeah.
The IMF also is not willing to let the money go to the African Development Bank.
They're not?
That's why they set up the RST.
Oh, the RST. Yeah. Okay. Thank you all very, very much.